One minute, Lurai Bennett had a family. The next, she had nothing but the dust from their stagecoach stinging her eyes. They'd left her. Just left her at the edge of a nothing town called Silverdale Creek, with a threadbare bag and a promise that felt like a lie, even as it left her father's lips. "We'll come back for you, Lurai." He couldn't even look at her when he said it. His new wife, her stepmother, had made sure of that. In 1873, a woman alone in the West was a ghost before she was even dead. At 22, with a leg that had never healed right, Lurai knew she was considered a burden. Damaged goods. They were heading for California gold, and she was just dead weight. She had exactly $3.42 to her name. It wasn't a future. It was a countdown to starvation. She limped toward the town's only general store, a single thought pounding in her head. Work. She needed work. Any work. The man inside didn't even bother to look up from his ledger for long. "Ain't hiring," he grunted. "Try the saloon. They might need a girl." The shame burned hotter than the Colorado sun. She was looking for respectable work, not to sell what little dignity she had left. "Beggars can't be choosers," the man said, dismissing her entirely. Fighting back tears, she turned away, the hope she'd clung to dissolving into ash. The sun was getting low, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A beautiful funeral for her last day of thinking she had a family. She needed a place to sleep, even a bench, before the cold of the night set in. That's when she heard it. The sound of a lone horse approaching. A rider. His form was a dark silhouette against the dying sun. She stepped aside, expecting him to pass right by. But he didn't. He slowed, then stopped right beside her. "Afternoon, miss," a deep voice rumbled. She looked up, and the man on the horse was tall, broad, with a face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His eyes, though, were a shocking, piercing blue. "Waiting for someone?" he asked. The question was a knife twisting in her gut. "No, sir," she swallowed. "I was just left here." The man's brow furrowed. He swung himself off his horse in one smooth, powerful motion. He was even taller on the ground. Maybe 30 years old, with a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite. "You're not left anymore," he said. The words were so simple, so certain, they knocked the air from her lungs. "I beg your pardon," she stammered. "Name's Quentin Reed," he said, extending a calloused hand. "Got a ranch about 10 miles north. My housekeeper just took ill. I need someone to cook and keep house." Lurai's mind reeled. A stranger. An isolated ranch. It was a recipe for disaster, the kind of story that ended with a shallow grave in the wilderness. But what choice did she have? The saloon, or the freezing night? "I can pay $8 a month," he went on, his blue eyes seeming to see right through her fear. "Plus room and board. You'd have your own cabin. You have my word as a gentleman. You'll be treated with respect." "Why me?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "A complete stranger." A flicker of something that looked like pain crossed his face. "Because 14 years ago, I was left behind too. Someone gave me a chance." He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "Night's coming on, Miss Bennett, and Silverdale Creek isn't kind to those without a place to go." He was right. Her options were gone. The approaching darkness felt like a predator. "I accept," she said, her voice barely audible. "Though I should tell you, I walk with a limp." He nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Can you read and write?" "Very well." "Then your leg is of no concern to me." Without another word, he lifted her onto his horse as if she weighed nothing at all, then mounted behind her. As they rode out of town, away from the dust and the pitying stares, Lurai felt a terrifying mix of relief and dread. She had just placed her entire life, what little was left of it, into the hands of a complete stranger. His presence was a solid wall at her back, and for the first time in years, she felt a sliver of something that might have been safety. But as the lights of Silverdale Creek vanished behind them, swallowed by the vast, dark wilderness, a new, chilling thought crept in. What if she hadn't just escaped her fate? What if she had just ridden right into a brand new, far more dangerous trap? The Reed Ranch was a fortress against the wilderness. A sturdy log house, a massive barn, and a handful of smaller buildings stood under the rising moon. A creek glittered like a silver ribbon beside the property. It was beautiful, but it was also isolated. Miles from anywhere, miles from anyone who could hear a scream. "This will be yours," Quentin said, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. He led the horse to a small cabin, separate from the main house. It was simple, with a small porch and a stone chimney. He helped her down, his hands steady at her waist, and for a moment they lingered just a fraction too long. Inside, he lit a lamp and the small stove, and the cabin bloomed with a warm, inviting light. It was a single room, but it was clean. Spotless, in fact. Almost too clean. There was food in the pantry, he told her. Enough for the night. "Get some rest, Miss Bennet," he said, his voice suddenly formal again. "We start early here." After he left, Lurai sank onto the narrow bed. Abandoned and employed in the same day. But the cabin felt strange. It didn't feel like a place where someone had lived for years. There were no personal touches, no scuff marks on the floor, no worn spot on the chair. It felt like a stage that had been set just for her. She ran a hand along the rough wooden table. Her fingers snagged on something caught in a crack between the boards. She pulled it free. It was a single long strand of silver-gray hair, the hair of an older woman. Mrs. Abernathy, the housekeeper who had supposedly taken ill. Lurai held it up to the lamplight. It shimmered. An unsettling feeling prickled down her spine. People who leave because of sickness don't scrub a place clean from top to bottom before they go. They leave in a hurry. They leave things behind. Lurai started to search. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she felt a desperate need to find something, anything, that felt real. Underneath the thin mattress on the bed, her fingers brushed against something hard. A book. A small leather-bound diary. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she opened it. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. The last entry was dated just 3 days ago. Her blood ran cold as she read the final, frantic words. "He knows I found it. I have to get away before he comes back. He is not the man he pretends to be. God help whoever comes next." Lurai slammed the diary shut, her hands shaking. God help whoever comes next. That was her. She was next. Quentin Reed wasn't a savior. He was a monster. And his last housekeeper hadn't taken ill. She had run for her life. Lurai's sanctuary was a cage. The warm cabin was a tomb waiting for its next occupant. She had to get out. But how? She was miles from town, with a bad leg and no horse. Quentin was in the main house just 50 yards away. He was bigger, stronger. She looked at the bolted door, the single window. There was no escape. She was trapped. All night she sat in the dark, clutching the diary, her mind a whirlwind of terror. Every creak of the floorboards, every howl of a distant coyote was him, coming for her. But the knock on her door at dawn was gentle. "Morning," Quentin said, holding a basket of fresh eggs and milk. His face was unreadable, his blue eyes calm. "Thought you might want to get settled before coming up to the main house." It was a test. He was watching her, waiting for a sign that she knew. She forced a smile, her lips feeling stiff and unnatural. "That's very thoughtful, thank you," she said, her voice a strained imitation of normal. She had to play along. She had to pretend she was the docile, grateful housekeeper he expected her to be. Her life depended on it. She spent the day in a state of high alert, every nerve screaming. He showed her around the main house, explaining her duties. Cooking, cleaning, laundry. The house was as sterile and impersonal as the cabin. It was the home of a man with deep, dark secrets. "I handle the ranch business myself," he said, leading her into his study. "But if you're willing, there are ledgers that could use organizing." The ledgers, financial records, maybe they held a clue, a reason. "I'd be happy to," she said, trying to keep the eagerness out of her voice. She had to find out what Mrs. Abernathy had discovered. She had to know what kind of monster she was living with. Later that day, she sat at his large oak desk, the leather-bound ledgers open before her. Quentin worked at the other end of the desk, the silence broken only by the scratching of their pens. It was a terrifying imitation of domestic peace. Her eyes scanned the columns of numbers. Cattle sales, supply purchases, wages. It all seemed normal until she found it. A separate section at the back of the book, regular payments, made every month for the last 2 years. The recipient was listed only as J.H. in Denver. The payments were substantial, far more than a rancher would pay for any normal expense. Was this blackmail? Was Quentin Reed being bled dry by someone who knew his secret? The initials J.H. meant nothing to her. But then she noticed the dates. The payments had started right around the time his fiancée, Elizabeth, had broken off their engagement. He told her Elizabeth left because she couldn't handle the primitive life. But what if that was a lie? What if she had discovered the same thing Mrs. Abernathy had? What if J.H. was someone Elizabeth had hired? Or worse, someone Quentin was paying to keep quiet about what really happened to her? A week crept by in agonizing slowness. Lurai played her part perfectly. She cooked his meals, cleaned his house, and spent her evenings pretending to read on her porch, while her mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. She learned his routines, the way he patrolled the property, the times he was furthest from the house. She was planning her escape. One evening, he approached her cabin as the sun was setting. He was carrying 2 cups and a bottle of whiskey. Her heart leaped into her throat. "Thought you might enjoy some company," he said. "It's my birthday." The casual announcement was jarring. A monster with a birthday. She forced herself to accept the drink, her hand trembling slightly. They sat in silence for a while, the tension a living thing between them. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He looked out at the darkening hills. "I was engaged once," he said, his voice quiet. "Elizabeth, a banker's daughter. She came to visit, stayed 2 weeks." He paused. "She said she couldn't marry a man who lived in such primitive conditions." It was the same story he'd told her before, a well-rehearsed lie. Lurai thought about the ledger, the payments to J.H. The lie was a wall he had built around himself, and she was trapped inside it with him. The next day, he made an unexpected offer. "Would you care to ride with me tomorrow? There's a part of the property I think you'd enjoy seeing." It was a trap, a way to get her even further from any hope of escape. But refusing would be suspicious. She had to go. She had to keep pretending. He led her to a rise overlooking a small, shimmering lake. It was beautiful, a place of serene, natural peace that felt like a cruel joke. "This is the heart of the ranch," he said, a genuine note of pride in his voice. How could a man with such darkness inside him appreciate beauty like this? They sat on a blanket, and he shared stories about building the ranch. He told her about being left behind as a boy, about an old rancher named Henry Townsend who had taken him in and left him the first 20 acres of this land. The story was so convincing, so full of heartfelt detail, that for a terrifying moment, she almost believed him. She almost forgot the diary in her cabin, the fear that had been her constant companion. But then she remembered the final frantic words. He is not the man he pretends to be. That night, back in her cabin, she reread the diary, searching for the clue she'd missed. What was it that Mrs. Abernathy had found? The diary was full of daily observations, notes about the weather, gardening, her health. But in the weeks before her frantic final entry, one name kept appearing: Jed. She wrote about Jed Harker, a name that meant nothing to Lurai. The entries were cryptic. Jed was here again today. Asked more questions about the fire. I told him I know nothing. And a few days later, he won't leave it be. He says Quentin is lying about what happened to Elizabeth. The fire. What fire? And who was Jed Harker? Was he J.H.? From the ledger? The questions swirled in her mind, a storm with no end. Quentin was a liar. Mrs. Abernathy had discovered the lie. And now this man, Jed Harker, was looking for answers. Lurai wasn't just a replacement housekeeper. She was a pawn in a very dangerous game she didn't understand. July brought a suffocating heat, and with it, a new tension on the ranch. Quentin announced he had to go to Denver on business. He'd be gone for 3 days. This was it. This was her chance, her one and only chance to escape. "Will you be all right here alone?" he asked, his blue eyes searching her face. "Of course," she said, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched him ride away the next morning, a cloud of dust marking his departure. The moment he was out of sight, she felt a wave of dizzying relief. She was free. But she had to be smart. She couldn't just run. She needed a plan. She would wait until nightfall, take food from the pantry, and walk south. It would be a brutal journey with her leg, but it was better than staying. The second day, she was hanging laundry when she heard them. 3 riders approaching the house. Her blood turned to ice. It wasn't Quentin. These men were rough, trail-worn, and they moved with a dangerous confidence. The leader, a tall man with a jagged scar down his cheek, swung off his horse and looked her up and down. "Well, well," he drawled. "Reed's got himself a new one." "Mr. Reed isn't here," she said, her voice shaking. "You'll have to come back." The man grinned, a cold, predatory expression. "That's why we're here, darling," he said. "Name's Jed Harker." Jed Harker, the name from the diary. He was real. He was here. Lurai's mind raced. Was he here to hurt her, or was he the key to everything? "We'll just wait for him," Harker said, stepping onto the porch as if he owned it. His 2 men flanked him, their eyes cold and watchful. Just then, the 2 ranch hands, Samuel and Luke, came around the side of the barn, rifles held loosely in their hands. "Everything all right, Miss Bennett?" Samuel asked, his gaze fixed on Harker. There was a tense standoff. Harker looked from the armed ranch hands to Lurai, and then he smiled that cold smile again. "Another time, then," he said. He tipped his hat to Lurai. "Tell Reed that Harker sends his regards, and tell him I'm not done asking questions about my sister." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Lurai trembling on the porch. His sister. Lurai's head spun. He hadn't said Elizabeth. He said, "my sister." She stumbled back to her cabin and grabbed the diary. She flipped through the pages frantically. And then she saw it. A name she'd overlooked before, mentioned only once in passing. "Mrs. Abernathy's kindness reminds me of my own mother. She even mentioned her maiden name was Harker." Mrs. Abernathy wasn't just the former housekeeper. She was Jed Harker's sister. The woman who had fled in terror was related to the man Quentin was paying off. This wasn't blackmail. It was hush money. Quentin wasn't paying Jed Harker to stay away. He was paying him to keep his mouth shut about what had happened to his sister. He hadn't just scared her off. He had done something to her, something that was worth a fortune in silence. Quentin returned that afternoon, his face a mask of fury when Samuel told him about Harker's visit. He strode directly to Lurai's cabin. "Are you all right? Did he threaten you?" he demanded. "I'm fine," she said, the lie tasting like poison. He paced the small porch like a caged wolf. "Harker's dangerous," he growled. "He blames me for something that wasn't my fault." It was another lie. Lurai could feel it. The carefully constructed world Quentin had built was starting to crumble, and she was standing at the epicenter when it all came down. That night, a summer storm rolled in, mirroring the tempest in her soul. Thunder cracked, and rain lashed against the windows. She was trapped in her cabin, the storm a perfect cover for whatever horrors the night might hold. August came, and with it, the annual cattle drive. Quentin would be gone for a week. "Samuel will stay here," he told her before he left. "If there's any sign of trouble, he'll take you to town." The promise of protection felt like a threat. The ranch was emptier, quieter, but the sense of dread was heavier than ever. On the fourth day of his absence, the sky turned a bruised purple, and another storm broke. The rain was a solid wall, the wind a screaming banshee. Lurai was securing the door to her cabin when she saw him through the downpour. A lone rider. Jed Harker. He rode directly to her cabin. This time, there were no ranch hands to save her. She bolted the door, her heart a frantic drum. "Miss Bennett," his voice boomed over the thunder. "Open up. I know he's gone. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to warn you." "Leave," she screamed back. "You have to get out of there," he yelled, "before he comes back. You don't know what he is. Ask him what happened to Elizabeth. Ask him about the fire at the Townsend place." The door splintered under his boot. He stood there soaking wet, a desperate, hunted look in his eyes. "You're in danger," he gasped. "My sister, she found proof. He killed Henry Townsend. He set that fire to cover it up and take this ranch." Before Lurai could even process the horrifying accusation, another figure appeared in the doorway, framed by the lightning. Quentin. He was back early. His face was a thundercloud of rage, his pistol aimed directly at Harker. "Let her go, Harker." Quentin's voice was deadly calm. "This is between you and me." "She needs to know the truth, Reed," Harker yelled, grabbing Lurai's arm and pulling her in front of him as a shield. "She needs to know you're a murderer." "Drop your gun," Quentin commanded, "or she gets hurt." Lurai looked from Harker's desperate face to Quentin's cold, furious one. A murderer. The man who had saved her was a killer who had stolen this land. It all clicked into place. The lies, the money, the fear in Mrs. Abernathy's diary. In that split second, she knew Harker was telling the truth. She stomped on Harker's foot and dropped to the floor, expecting Quentin to shoot him. But the gunshot that rang out wasn't from Quentin's gun. It was from a third direction. Samuel, the old ranch hand, stood near the barn, his rifle smoking. Harker crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He looked at Lurai, his eyes wide with shock and betrayal. "He made me," Samuel stammered, his face pale with horror. "The boss. He said Harker was here to hurt you." Quentin didn't even look at Harker's body. He walked toward Lurai, his pistol still in his hand, his blue eyes no longer kind, but cold and possessive. "Now," he said, his voice a low growl. "Where were we?" The world had shrunk to the size of the cabin, thick with the smell of rain, blood, and betrayal. Jed Harker lay dead on the floor. Samuel stood frozen by the barn, a pawn who had just made a king's move. And Quentin Reed, the savior, the gentleman, was walking toward her, his mask finally, terrifyingly gone. He was lying, Quentin said, his voice smooth as polished stone. He was a cattle rustler, a common thief. He's been trying to blackmail me for years. But Lurai saw the truth in the flicker of his eyes. He wasn't telling her a story to calm her down. He was testing her. He was seeing if she would believe the lie. Her life depended on her answer. "I know," she whispered, forcing the words out. "I was so scared." She let her body tremble, playing the part of the terrified victim. It wasn't hard. The terror was real. Relief, cold and calculating, washed over his face. He holstered his pistol. The immediate danger had passed, but a new, more horrifying reality set in. She was his. She knew his secret, or at least he thought she might know. He would never let her go now. "We'll take his body to the sheriff," Quentin said, his voice returning to that calm, commanding tone. "Samuel, get some rope." The journey to town was a nightmare. Harker's body was slung over his own horse. Quentin rode beside her, a silent, menacing presence. He was telling a story, a carefully crafted fiction for the sheriff. Harker had come to kidnap her, a crazed act of revenge, and Samuel had shot him in her defense. It was a perfect story, and she was the star witness. The sheriff, a weary man who seemed to know Quentin well, bought every word. "Good riddance," he said, looking at Harker's body. That man was nothing but trouble. He offered them rooms at the hotel to rest before riding back. Lurai knew it wasn't an offer. It was a command from Quentin, a way to keep her close, to make sure she didn't break. In the sterile hotel room, the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. Quentin had killed Henry Townsend, the old man who had treated him like a son. He had started a fire to hide his crime and had inherited the ranch. His entire life, this empire he had built, was founded on murder. His ex-fiancée, Elizabeth, must have found out. What had he done to her? And Mrs. Abernathy, Harker's sister, had met the same fate. Lurai was the only one left who knew the truth. Or at least, pieces of it. A soft knock came at her door. It was Quentin. "I wanted to check on you," he said, his voice full of feigned concern. He stepped inside, and she could feel the air thicken, the space shrink. He came and stood behind her as she sat at the small vanity, and he picked up her comb. "You're so brave," he murmured, his touch impossibly gentle as he began to comb her hair. The gesture was so tender, so intimate, it was obscene. It was the touch of a predator, lulling its prey. "When I hired you," he said softly, his lips close to her ear, "I just needed a housekeeper, but you've become so much more than that." She held her breath. "I've tried to keep my distance, to be respectful, but tonight, when I thought he might hurt you, I realized I can't live without you." The words were a death sentence. He wasn't just going to keep her prisoner. He was going to own her, body and soul. "Marry me, Lurai," he whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a claim, a brand. If she refused, he would know she suspected him. He would kill her, just like the others. If she accepted, she would be chaining herself to a monster for the rest of her life, a life that could end at any moment. Tears streamed down her face. He would mistake them for tears of joy. "Yes," she choked out. "Yes, I'll marry you." His arms wrapped around her, pulling her into a fierce embrace. His kiss was possessive, a seal on their dark contract. She felt nothing but ice in her veins. She had just agreed to marry her jailer, a cold-blooded murderer. But as he held her, a tiny, defiant spark ignited in the darkness. He thought he had won. He thought she was a broken, grateful little bird in his gilded cage. He had no idea who he was dealing with. She would be his perfect, loving wife. She would earn his trust. She would learn all his secrets. And then she would find a way to burn his entire world to the ground. The wedding was a surreal spectacle, a small, intimate affair held on the ranch 3 weeks later. Quentin had built a wedding arch, draping it in wildflowers. The few neighbors who attended saw a fairy tale. The wealthy, handsome rancher marrying his humble, devoted housekeeper. They saw love in his eyes. Lurai saw possession. She wore a beautiful ivory dress he had ordered from Denver. It felt like a burial shroud. As she repeated her vows, promising to love, honor, and obey, she felt a cold resolve settle in her heart. She was making a promise not to him, but to Jed Harker, to Mrs. Abernathy, to Elizabeth, and to old Henry Townsend. She would honor their memory. She would see justice done. Her new home, the main house, was a larger, more comfortable prison. Her days were a performance. She was the perfect wife, adoring, attentive, efficient. She managed his home with a skill that impressed him. She organized his ledgers with a mind for numbers that he praised. And all the while, she was gathering information. She was looking for the proof Mrs. Abernathy had found. She searched his study relentlessly whenever he was out on the range. She looked for hidden compartments in his desk, loose floorboards, hollowed-out books. Nothing. He was meticulous. He had covered his tracks perfectly. Her only hope was Samuel, the ranch hand. He was the key. He had killed Harker on Quentin's order. He was an accomplice. But he was also terrified. She could see it in his eyes. He avoided her, his guilt a heavy cloak around him. One afternoon she found him in the barn, mending a bridle, his hands shaking. "Samuel," she said softly. He flinched. "I need to talk to you." "Nothing to talk about, Mrs. Reed," he mumbled, not looking at her. "Jed Harker was a bad man." "Quentin told you to kill him, didn't he?" she said, her voice a quiet challenge. He froze. The blood drained from his face. "He said Harker was there to hurt you," he whispered. "He said it was the only way." "And you believe him?" she pressed. "You believe everything the boss tells you?" His eyes darted around nervously. "It ain't my place to believe, ma'am. It's my place to do as I'm told." He was a dead end. Fear had locked his lips tighter than any oath. She had to find another way. She began to subtly question Quentin, planting seeds of conversation about the past. She asked about Henry Townsend, praising the man's generosity. Quentin's stories were flawless, full of warmth and admiration for his mentor. He was either the world's best liar, or he was truly a sociopath, completely detached from his own crimes. Months bled into a year. Lurai's hope began to wane. She was trapped in a perfect life that was actually a perfect hell. She played the role of Mrs. Reed so well, she was sometimes afraid she was forgetting who Lurai Bennett truly was. Then, she discovered she was pregnant. The news was a complicated agony. A child, his child. A baby was a new chain, binding her to him more tightly than any wedding ring. But it was also a weapon. Quentin was ecstatic. The idea of a son, an heir to his stolen empire, softened him. He became less guarded, more indulgent. He started drinking more whiskey in the evenings, celebrating his impending fatherhood. And when he drank, he sometimes talked. One night, as a winter storm raged outside, he was in a maudlin, drunken state. "My father," he slurred, staring into the fire. "He was a hard man, hated this land, hated me." He told her a story of his childhood, a tale of poverty and abuse, a story designed to make her pity him. "He used to lock me in the cellar," Quentin whispered, his voice thick with self-pity. "Sometimes for days." Lurai listened, her expression sympathetic, her mind cold and sharp as an icicle. She knew what he was doing. He was building a new narrative, one where he was the victim. "That's why I had to be strong," he continued. "That's why when he got sick, I knew I had to take control. He was weak. He would have lost the ranch. I did what had to be done. For the land. It was a confession, not of murder, but of motive. He saw himself as the rightful heir, the only one strong enough to hold the land. He believed his own lies. He believed he was justified. The baby, a boy they named Thomas, was born in the spring. Holding her son, Lurai felt a fierce, protective love that solidified her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for ghosts anymore. She was fighting for her child's future, a future free from his father's bloody legacy. She had to find the proof. She had to. And one day she did. It wasn't in the house. It was outside. She was planting a new rose bush, a gift from Quentin, near the foundation of the old Townsend cabin, which had been torn down years ago. Her shovel struck something metal. She dug around it, her heart starting to pound. It was a small tin box, rusted and heavy. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were two things. A signed confession from a doctor in Denver, stating that Henry Townsend had not died of a weak heart, but had been poisoned with arsenic over a period of weeks. And a letter from Elizabeth, Quentin's ex-fiancée, to her father. In it she wrote that she had discovered Quentin was poisoning his benefactor and that she was afraid for her life. She was leaving, and she begged her father to go to the authorities. She never made it. Lurai stared at the papers, the proof she had spent 2 years searching for. Mrs. Abernathy must have found this box. This is what she ran from. This is what her brother died for. Lurai carefully reburied the box. She couldn't just go to the sheriff. Quentin owned the sheriff. He owned this whole county. If she made a move and failed, he would kill her and their son without a second thought. She needed a plan, a perfect, foolproof plan. She had to get Quentin to confess. On tape, so to speak. She needed an outside witness, someone Quentin would never suspect. And she knew just who it was. The new reverend who had arrived in Silverdale Creek a few months prior. He was a young, idealistic man, horrified by the lawlessness of the frontier. She began attending church, becoming a model of piety, donating generously to the church fund. She confided in the reverend, telling him her husband had a heavy conscience, a dark secret from his past that tormented him. She asked if the reverend would be willing to make a visit to the ranch, to speak with her husband, to offer him God's grace and a chance at redemption. The reverend, eager to save a soul, readily agreed. The stage was set. Lurai chose the night of their 3rd wedding anniversary. She cooked a special dinner, opened his favorite bottle of whiskey, and made sure his glass was never empty. She was loving, attentive, the perfect wife. When he was sufficiently drunk and sentimental, she began. "Quentin, my love," she said, taking his hand. "There's something that's been weighing on my heart, about your past, about Henry." He tensed. "What about him?" "I know you did what you had to do," she said, her voice a soothing balm. "He was weak. You were strong. You saved this ranch. But the guilt, I see it in your eyes. It eats at you." He pulled his hand away. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I do," she insisted. "I know everything. I know about the poison. I know about Elizabeth. I found her letter. My love, I found the box." Panic flared in his eyes, quickly replaced by a cold fury. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What did you find?" "The truth," she said, her own voice steady, all pretense gone. "And it's all right. I don't love you any less for it. I love your strength. I love the man who was willing to do whatever it took." It was a monstrous gamble. She was appealing to his vanity, his sociopathic pride. For a moment, he stared at her, his mind working behind his cold blue eyes. He was trying to decide if she was telling the truth, or if this was a trap. Then, a slow, arrogant smile spread across his face. He believed her. He actually believed she was as twisted as he was. "You truly are the perfect wife for me," he said, stepping toward her. "I knew it the moment I saw you." "So it's true," she breathed, her voice full of faked admiration. "You did it?" "Henry was a sentimental old fool," he boasted, pouring another whiskey. "He was going to sell the ranch to some investor from back east. I couldn't let that happen. This land is mine. It was always meant to be mine. And Elizabeth, she was weak, just like him. She would have ruined everything." Right on cue, there was a knock at the door. "Who is that?" Quentin snapped, his good mood evaporating. "It's the Reverend," Lurai said calmly. "I asked him to come. I told him you had a confession to make, that you wanted to clear your conscience before God." The color drained from Quentin's face. He turned to her, the realization of the trap dawning in his eyes. The look was no longer of love, or even possession. It was pure, unadulterated hatred. He lunged for her, his hands outstretched, his face a mask of rage. "You bitch!" he roared. But Lurai was ready. She sidestepped him and grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. He came at her again, and she swung it with all the strength of her desperation, her fear, and her long-nurtured rage. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. He staggered back, his eyes wide with disbelief, before crashing to the floor. The Reverend burst in, his face white with shock at the scene before him. Quentin Reed, the powerful rancher, lay unconscious on the floor, and his quiet, pious wife stood over him, holding a fireplace poker, her face a mixture of terror and triumphant resolve. "He was going to kill me," Lurai said, her voice shaking but clear. "He just confessed. He confessed to everything." The aftermath was a storm of its own. The Reverend, having overheard Quentin's final damning words before he lunged, became Lurai's unshakable witness. When the sheriff arrived, he was forced to listen. Lurai led them to the tin box buried by the old cabin foundation. The proof was undeniable. Quentin Reed, the pillar of the community, was arrested for the murders of Henry Townsend and Elizabeth, the banker's daughter, whose body was later found in an abandoned well on the far edge of the property. Samuel, the ranch hand, broke down completely, confessing to his role in Jed Harker's death and corroborating Lurai's entire story. He was given a lenient sentence in exchange for his testimony. The trial was the biggest event the Colorado Territory had ever seen. People came from miles around to watch the beautiful, limping woman who had brought down a monster. Lurai stood in the courtroom, calm and resolute, and told her story. The story of a girl left for dead, who was saved only to be imprisoned, and who had to become stronger than the monster who held her captive. Quentin Reed was found guilty and sentenced to hang. Lurai inherited the ranch. As the sole heir of her husband, and with no one to contest the claim, the entire 600-acre empire built on blood and lies was now hers. Her and her sons. On the day of the execution, she didn't go into town to watch. Instead, she stood on the porch of the main house, holding little Thomas's hand. She looked out at the rolling hills, the pine forests, and the distant mountains. The land was beautiful, wild, and finally, it was safe. It was hers, earned not with poison and secrets, but with courage and a promise she had made to the ghosts of the past. Her father, hearing of the sensational trial and his daughter's newfound wealth, wrote her a letter, full of remorse and begging for a reconciliation. He wanted to come see his grandson. Lurai read the letter, then calmly dropped it into the fire. She had no family but the one she had forged in the crucible of fear and survival. Her son, and the memory of those who had died for the truth. She was Lurai Bennett Reed. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer a prisoner. She had been left behind, abandoned and broken. But in the end, she was the one who was left standing. If you were moved by Lurai's story of resilience and justice, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button for more tales of the unexpected.